3,200 years ago, the world didn't just change, it ended. In less than a single lifetime, every superpower on Earth was erased from the map. The Hittites? Gone. The Mycenaeans? Even Egypt was left gasping for air. We aren't talking about a slow decline, we're talking about a total, coordinated blackout of human progress. But here is the mystery that keeps historians awake at night. What actually caused the Bronze Age civilizations to collapse? Was it an unstoppable sea people invasion? Or was the world so interconnected that one tiny crack brought the whole house of cards down? It makes you wonder, why did ancient civilizations collapse so perfectly at the same time? And did any civilizations survive the wreckage, or was everyone forced back into the literal dark? The catastrophe lasted over a century, but what if the Bronze Age collapse never happened? Would we be walking on Mars today? To understand what happened after the Bronze Age collapse, we have to look at the fingerprints left in the ruins. Let's solve history's greatest whodunit. What caused the Bronze Age civilization to collapse? The collapse of the Bronze Age wasn't caused by a single event, but by a perfect storm of multiple failures that hit the world all at once. Around 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was a highly connected system of superpowers, and like any complex machine, when one gear broke, the whole thing seized up. First, the environment turned hostile. Scientific data from ancient pollen and cave minerals shows that a megadrought hit the region, lasting for decades. This caused massive crop failures, leading to widespread famine. When the kings couldn't feed their people, the social order dissolved, sparking internal peasant revolts and civil wars. Second, this instability triggered a massive migration of sea peoples, groups of displaced refugees and raiders who began attacking coastal cities. While they were once blamed as the sole cause, we now know they were a symptom of the chaos. Their raids cut off the vital international trade routes that these empires depended on. Because bronze requires both copper and tin had to be imported from thousands of miles away, the loss of trade meant these civilizations could no longer produce the tools or weapons they needed to survive. Finally, nature added to the misery with a series of earthquake storms. For about 50 years, the fault lines in Greece and the Levant became hyperactive, leveling palaces and city walls that were already weakened by war and hunger. These civilizations were so hyper-specialized and top-heavy that once the central palaces were destroyed, there was no backup system. The entire globalized economy of the ancient world simply vanished. Did any civilizations survive the Bronze Age collapse? While the map of the ancient world was being scorched, survival wasn't about who was the strongest, but who was the most adaptable. As the great powers of Greece and Anatolia vanished into ash, a few entities managed to white-knuckle their way through the chaos, though they emerged as shadows of their former selves. Egypt is the most famous survivor, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Under Pharaoh Ramesses III, the Egyptians fought desperate, bloody battles against the sea peoples on both land and sea. They won, but the cost was catastrophic. The treasury was drained to pay for the defense, leading to the first recorded labor strikes in history. Egypt survived, but they lost their empire in Canaan and retreated into a long period of isolation and decline. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrians managed to hold their core territory. Protected by a hyper-militarized society and a geography that sat slightly outside the Mediterranean trade trap, they became a fortress state. They didn't collapse, but they were forced into survival mode for over a century, fending off nomadic tribes fleeing the same droughts that destroyed the West. The most successful survivors were actually the Phoenicians, the coastal Canaanites. While the inland empires fell because they relied on massive bureaucracies, the Phoenician cities like Tyre and Sidon were agile. They pivoted from being middlemen for kings to becoming independent merchant princes. They didn't just survive, they thrived in the vacuum, eventually spreading their alphabet across the world. Finally, Cyprus survived through sheer economic necessity. Its copper mines were the lifeblood of the era. Even as their cities were burned, people moved back in almost immediately. They became a bridge between the old world and the new, keeping the embers of Bronze Age technology burning while everyone else was descending into darkness. Why did ancient civilizations collapse? To understand why these titans fell, we have to look past the external triggers like drought and look at the internal structural flaws of the civilizations themselves. They didn't just fall, they crumbled under their own weight. The primary reason was hypercomplexity. Bronze Age empires were top-heavy. Everything, food distribution, law, trade, and religion, was managed by a single central palace. This made the system incredibly efficient during good times, but extremely fragile during bad ones. If a palace was burned or a king died, there was no no plan B. The common people didn't know how to run the complex irrigation systems or manage the trade routes, so the entire social machine simply stopped working. Another factor was the trap of globalization. These civilizations were the first to be truly interdependent. They relied on a global supply chain for bronze. Bronze requires copper and tin, but tin was often sourced from thousands of miles away. When the trade routes became unsafe due to regional instability, the empires lost their ability to create tools and weapons. It was an ancient version of a modern total economic collapse. Once the supply chain snapped, the technology of the age became impossible to maintain. Finally, there was a massive social decoupling. The great kings of the era were obsessed with prestige, building massive monuments and fighting expensive wars while their populations suffered from soil exhaustion and rising taxes. This created a resilience gap. When the droughts hit, the peasants had no loyalty to a system that had squeezed them dry. In many cases, the collapse was actually an internal revolution where the people chose to abandon the cities and return to a simpler, tribal way of life rather than die for a failing crown. What if the Bronze Age collapse never happened? If the Bronze Age collapse had never occurred, the trajectory of human history would have been accelerated by nearly 1,000 years. We would be looking at a world where the momentum of the great empires, the Egyptians, Hittites, and Mycenaeans, remained unbroken, leading to a high Bronze Age that likely would have transitioned into an industrial era far earlier than our own. Technologically, the loss of knowledge would have been avoided. When the palaces fell in our timeline, writing systems like linear B vanished, and engineering secrets were buried for centuries. Without that reset, the sophisticated mathematics used to build pyramids and irrigation systems would have evolved directly into advanced physics and mechanics. We might have seen the steam engine or complex maritime navigation developed by 500 BC, potentially placing humanity in the space age while our actual ancestors were still fighting with iron swords. Socially and politically, however, the world might be much less free. The collapse was a great reset that allowed for the rise of the underdog. Without the vacuum left by the fallen giants, small cultures like the Greeks and their experiments with democracy or the Romans and their republican laws might never have had the room to grow. The world would likely have remained a collection of massive, centralized autocracies ruled by god-kings. Global culture would be dominated by rigid hierarchies and palace bureaucracies rather than the individualistic and philosophical traditions that emerged from the ruins. We would be a more technologically advanced species, but one still living under the shadow of the Bronze Age crowns. How long did the Bronze Age collapse last? The Bronze Age collapse was not a single, sharp event like a modern stock market crash. It was a grueling, agonizing century of chaos. Most historians pin the active phase of the collapse between 1200 BC and 1150 BC, but the tremors were felt long before, and the world didn't truly stabilize for much longer. The initial shattering took about 50 years. During this window, the great cities of the Mediterranean fell like dominoes. Hattusa, the capital of the Hittites, was abandoned and burned around 1180 BC. Mycenae and the Greek palatial centers were destroyed in waves during the same period. To a person living through it, this was a lifetime of constant threat, a half-century where the civilized world simply went dark, trade stopped, and the security of the state vanished. However, the Dark Age that followed lasted much longer. In Greece, for example, it took nearly 400 years, from 1100 BC to 750 BC, for the population to return to its previous levels and for writing to be reinvented. During this time, the grand stone architecture of the past was replaced by small mud brick huts, and the memory of the Age of Heroes faded into myth and oral tradition. In the Near East and Egypt, the recovery was slightly faster, but the instability lasted for about 150 years. It wasn't until the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire around 900 BC that a new, dominant superpower emerged to bring a sense of global order back to the region. The Bronze Age collapse was a long death that required generations of struggle before humanity could finally pivot into the Iron Age. What happened after the Bronze Age collapse? The aftermath of the collapse was not just a period of silence, it was a radical rebirth. When the smoke finally cleared around 1000 BC, the world that emerged was unrecognizable. The death of the old god-kings allowed for the birth of the Iron Age, a period defined by decentralization, new technology, and the rise of the individual. The most significant change was the democratization of metal. Bronze was expensive and required international trade for tin, making it a metal of the elites. Iron, however, was everywhere. Once the secret of smelting iron spread, every local farmer could afford a plow and every tribal militia could afford a sword. This broke the monopoly of the palace economies. Power shifted away from a few massive empires and into the hands of smaller, more aggressive city-states and kingdoms. Culturally, this was the era of the Great Reset. In Greece, the memory of the fallen Mycenaean palaces was transformed into the epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were a way for a Dark Age people to make sense of the giant ruins they lived amongst. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians revolutionized the world by simplifying the complex writing systems of the past into a 22-letter alphabet. Unlike the difficult hieroglyphs used by elites, this alphabet was designed for merchants, making literacy accessible to the masses for the first time. Politically, the vacuum left by the Hittites and the weakened Egyptians allowed for the rise of new players. The Neo-Assyrians built the world's first true empire based on professional standing armies, while in the Levant, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah emerged. This was the forge in which the modern world was shaped. The Bronze Age collapse was a tragedy of unimaginable scale, but without it, the foundations of modern philosophy, religion, and democracy would never have had the space to take root. 3,200 years ago, the world didn't just change, it ended. In a single lifetime, every superpower was erased from the map. The Hittites? Gone. The Mycenaeans? Even Egypt was left gasping for air. This wasn't a slow decline. It was a total, coordinated blackout of human progress. So, what caused the Bronze Age civilization to collapse? It was a perfect storm. A decades-long mega-drought killed the crops, while earthquake storms leveled city walls. This triggered the Sea People, refugees turned raiders who cut the global supply chain. Because these empires were hyper-connected, once the trade for tin and copper snapped, the system seized up. Did any civilizations survive? Egypt white-knuckled through the fire but emerged as a shadow of itself. The Assyrians became a fortress state. But why did ancient civilizations collapse so completely? Because they were too top-heavy. When the central palace burned, there was no plan B. They optimized for luxury, not resilience. What if the Bronze Age collapse never happened? We might have reached the Space Age by 500 BC, but we'd still be ruled by god-kings. Instead, we got a Dark Age. How long did the Bronze Age collapse last? It took over 400 years for the lights to come back on. A grueling reset that wiped our collective memory. What happened after the Bronze Age collapse changed everything. From the ashes came the Iron Age, the alphabet, and the birth of democracy. The old world had to die so our world could be born. We are the survivors of a world that ended 3,000 years ago. The question is, if our threads started to snap today, what would we build from our ruins?